In the autumn of 1862, along the red clay banks of the Tallapoosa River in central Alabama, a cotton plantation known as Thornhill Estate became the site of one of the most disturbing scandals ever whispered about in the drawing rooms of Montgomery society. Colonel Edmund Thornhill, a man of 53 years and considerable wealth, did what no respectable planter of his station had ever dared. He publicly declared his enslaved concubine, a 24-year-old woman named Delphine, to be the mother of his rightful heir, and in a document signed before witnesses, named her unborn child as sole beneficiary of his entire fortune. The act would destroy his family, fracture his community, and leave behind a legacy so shameful that for generations the Thornhill name would be spoken only in hushed tones, if spoken at all. You are listening to Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, stories that reveal not only the brutality of the institution itself, but the complete moral collapse it engendered in those who wielded its power. Thornhill Estate sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of prime cotton land, worked by approximately 230 enslaved souls. The plantation had been in the Thornhill family since 1798, built on Creek Indian lands seized during the territorial expansion. Colonel Edmund Thornhill had inherited it from his father in 1840, and under his management it had prospered beyond measure. The Great House, a Greek Revival mansion with 6 towering columns and galleries on 3 sides, stood as a monument to the wealth extracted from cotton and human misery. Thornhill himself was educated at the College of William and Mary, a veteran of the Mexican War, a deacon in the Presbyterian Church, and a man whose reputation for severity toward his slaves was matched only by his fastidiousness in matters of honor and social propriety. His wife, Margaret Thornhill, née Beaumont, was 48 years old in 1862, the daughter of a prominent Charleston family. She had given birth to 3 children, but only one survived infancy, a daughter named Catherine, who was then 26 and married to a planter's son in Mobile. Margaret was known throughout the county as a woman of refined taste and Christian virtue, who supervised the domestic servants with a firm hand and taught Sunday school to the slave children, believing it her duty to save their souls even as she benefited from the sale of their bodies. She played the pianoforte, read French novels, and maintained an elaborate garden of camellias and magnolias that was the envy of neighboring plantations. By all accounts, the Thornhills' marriage was one of mutual respect, if not passion, built on shared class interests and the preservation of family legacy. But beneath the surface of this ordered world, a different reality had been unfolding for years. Delphine was born on Thornhill Estate in 1838, the daughter of a field hand named Scipio and a house servant named Rue. She was light-skinned, the product of an earlier generation's violation, with features that suggested mixed ancestry going back perhaps to her grandmother's time. From childhood, she had been marked for domestic service, trained as a lady's maid and seamstress. She was literate, having been taught to read by Margaret Thornhill herself in one of those contradictory gestures of slaveholding benevolence. By the age of 16, Delphine had caught the colonel's eye. What began as furtive encounters in the dependencies behind the great house became, over time, an arrangement so routine that the other slaves knew to make themselves scarce when the colonel visited the weaving house on certain evenings. Delphine bore her first child by Thornhill in 1857, a girl named Celia, who was allowed to remain with her mother and work in the kitchen. The second came in 1859, a boy who died in infancy. Margaret Thornhill knew, of course. All the wives knew. It was the great unspoken reality of plantation life, this parallel system of concubinage that existed alongside Christian marriage. The code of the plantation South demanded only that it remain invisible, that the forms of respectability be maintained. Delphine was never to speak to the colonel in the presence of white visitors. Her children were recorded in the slave ledgers with no father listed, and Margaret Thornhill continued to preside over her household as if the woman who mended her dresses and plaited her hair was not also bearing her husband's children. The catastrophe began not with passion, but with mortality. In March of 1862, As the Civil War raged and Confederate defeats began to mount, Colonel Thornhill fell gravely ill with what the physician diagnosed as consumption. For 6 weeks he lay fevered and coughing in his bedchamber, attended by Margaret and the house servants, and in those long hours of delirium, something in him shifted. Perhaps it was the proximity of death, or the news filtering in from the battlefields, where the Confederacy's future grew dimmer by the day. Perhaps it was guilt, though he had never shown evidence of that emotion before. Whatever the cause, when he recovered enough to sit upright and take nourishment, he summoned his attorney from Montgomery and dictated a new will. The document was extraordinary in its explicitness. It acknowledged Delphine by name as a woman of color residing at Thornhill Estate and recognized the child she now carries as his own. It stipulated that upon his death, Delphine was to be immediately emancipated, along with her daughter Celia. Moreover, the unborn child, if born alive, was to inherit the entirety of Thornhill Estate, all its lands, property, and enslaved workforce, to be held in trust until the age of 21. His legitimate daughter, Catherine, was left a modest annuity of $500 per year. His wife, Margaret, received only her widow's dower, 1/3 life interest in the estate, as required by Alabama law, but no more. Pause for a moment and consider what this meant. In a society where the entire legal and social structure was built on the fiction of black inferiority and white supremacy, where miscegenation was both ubiquitous and officially denied, where the children of slave women had no rights whatsoever, regardless of paternity, Colonel Thornhill was attempting to shatter every convention that held his world together. He was not merely acknowledging his mixed-race child, he was elevating that child above his own white daughter, above his wife, above every expectation of racial and social hierarchy. When the attorney, a man named Josiah Clemens, read the draft aloud in Thornhill's bedchamber, he reportedly set down the document and said, "Colonel, I must advise you in the strongest terms that this will cannot stand. No court in Alabama will honor it. You are disinheriting your legitimate white child in favor of a Negro bastard. It is against nature, against law, and against every principle of Christian civilization." Thornhill's response was recorded in Clemens' diary, which survived the war, and was later donated to the Alabama Department of Archives. "Then let nature, law, and civilization be damned. I have lived my life as a hypocrite, preaching virtue while practicing vice. I will not die one. This child will inherit what I have built, because every brick and bale of it was built on the backs of people like its mother, and I will not see one more generation of Thornhills grow fat on that lie." Clemens drafted the will as instructed, but he also did something else. He confided in Margaret Thornhill's brother, who held a position in the state legislature. Within a week, word of the colonel's intentions had spread through Montgomery's planter class like cholera. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. Edmund Thornhill had lost his mind. The illness had driven him to madness. He must be declared incompetent before he could destroy his family and set a precedent that would threaten the entire social order. If a slave woman could become an heiress, if mixed-race children could inherit white property, then the foundations of slave society would crumble. Already there were rumors of slave insurrections, of Lincoln's armies advancing, of a world turned upside down. This could not be permitted, but Thornhill recovered. By May, he was well enough to walk the grounds, inspect the fields, and resume management of the plantation, and he refused to recant. He had the will witnessed by 3 men, his overseer, a neighbor who owed him money, and a Methodist circuit rider who believed that slavery was a sin, and saw in Thornhill's act a kind of repentance. Delphine, now visibly pregnant, continued her work in the house. The other slaves watched and whispered, understanding that something unprecedented was happening, but unable to predict what it would mean for them. Margaret Thornhill's response was not rage, but something colder. She retreated into a rigid dignity, maintaining her routines with mechanical precision. She still presided over meals, still attended church, still received visitors, but she stopped speaking to her husband, except when absolutely necessary, and she never again entered the room where Delphine worked. To her daughter Catherine, who arrived from Mobile in a state of hysterical outrage, she said simply, "Your father has made his choice. We will endure it as Christian women must endure all trials, and we will outlive it. If you want to continue receiving stories like this, stories that excavate the hidden truths of the American South and confront the moral catastrophe of slavery without flinching, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and join us in this necessary work of historical reckoning." The child was born in August of 1862, during the hottest week of summer, when the cotton stood high in the fields, and the air hung thick with the threat of thunderstorms. It was a boy, healthy and light-skinned, with his father's straight nose and his mother's dark eyes. Thornhill was present at the birth, an unthinkable violation of propriety, and when the midwife placed the infant in his arms, witnesses reported that he wept. He named the boy Edmund Jr., though he could not by law give him the Thornhill surname. The baptismal record listed him simply as Edmund, son of Delphine, a woman of color. For 3 months, an uneasy equilibrium held. Thornhill doted on the child in private, visiting the cabin where Delphine now lived separately from the other slaves. He had it furnished with items from the great house, a proper bed, a cradle, even a small mirror and a rug. He gave Delphine money, though she had no legal right to own it, and promised that when he died, she and the children would go north to Philadelphia or New York, where they could live as free people. Whether he believed this would actually happen, or whether it was simply a fantasy to comfort himself, is impossible to know, but the white community would not let it stand. The Presbyterian church elders visited Thornhill and informed him that his continued membership was incompatible with his present conduct. The sheriff, citing concerns about domestic tranquility, suggested that Delphine be sold away to prevent further scandal. Thornhill's factor in Montgomery wrote to say that several planters were refusing to do business with him, and his own daughter Catherine arrived with her husband and announced that they were contesting the will on grounds of mental incompetence, that they had already consulted with 3 attorneys in Mobile, and that they would see the matter through to the highest courts if necessary. In October, Margaret Thornhill did something that surprised everyone. She invited the wives of the neighboring planters to tea, an elegant afternoon gathering in the formal parlor. She served Madeira and almond cake, played the pianoforte, and discussed the progress of the war with perfect composure. Then, as the ladies prepared to leave, she said quietly, "I want you all to know that my husband is not insane. He is morally compromised, as are all men who keep slaves and use them as he has used that woman, but he is not mad. What he has done is simply the logical conclusion of a system we have all profited from and pretended not to see. If we condemn him, we must condemn ourselves." The statement was so unexpected, so devastating in its honesty, that the women departed in confused silence. Some thought Margaret had suffered a nervous collapse. Others believed she was engaging in a sophisticated form of revenge, using the truth as a weapon against her husband and his allies. But what is clear from the letters and diaries that survive is that Margaret Thornhill had reached a point of such profound disillusionment that she could no longer maintain the lies that sustained her class. She did not forgive her husband, but she also refused to participate in the fiction that he was uniquely depraved. If Edmund was a monster, then they were all monsters, and she would not pretend otherwise. In those final months of 1862, Thornhill Estate became a kind of theater of collapse, a microcosm of the dying Confederacy itself. The slaves worked the cotton fields as they always had, but with a new awareness that the old order was breaking down. Some ran away, others waited to see what would happen. Delphine kept to her cabin, caring for the infant Edmund and trying to make sense of a situation for which there was no precedent. She had not asked for any of this. She had been 15 years old when Thornhill first summoned her, with no more power to refuse him than she had to refuse picking cotton. Now she was the subject of vicious gossip, blamed by some whites for seducing the colonel, and by some slaves for collaborating with their oppressor. The truth was far simpler and far more terrible. She was a woman caught in a system that had never allowed her a single choice of her own, and even the colonel's bizarre attempt at restitution was ultimately about his own conscience, not her freedom. The crisis came in December. Catherine and her husband filed a formal petition in the Mobile Probate Court to have Colonel Thornhill declared mentally incompetent and to void his recent will. The case attracted attention throughout Alabama and beyond. Newspapers as far away as Richmond and Atlanta reported on the Thornhill scandal. The language used was telling. Thornhill was described as having fallen under unnatural influence, as having been poisoned by abolitionist sentiment, as suffering from a monomania regarding the Negro race. The underlying argument was always the same: no sane white man would elevate a black woman and her child to such a position, therefore Thornhill must be insane. The alternative, that he might be acting from some combination of guilt, love, and moral clarity, was literally unthinkable within the framework of Southern white supremacy. Thornhill hired attorneys of his own, and they prepared to fight the competency hearing. But before it could take place, on the morning of December 18, 1862, Colonel Edmund Thornhill walked out to the old family cemetery on the edge of the property, where his parents and 2 infant children were buried, and shot himself through the heart with a pistol. He left no note. His body was discovered by the overseer an hour later, lying between the graves of his mother and his first son. Consider, if you will, what drives a man to such an end. Was it shame? Was it the realization that he could not, even with all his wealth and power, undo the evil he had participated in for decades? Was it despair at seeing his world collapse around him, both the personal world of his family and the larger world of the Confederacy? Or was it something simpler and more terrible, the recognition that there was no way forward, that he had created a situation for which there was no good resolution, that every choice led to suffering? The funeral was a grim affair, attended by few. The Presbyterian minister refused to preside over the service of a suicide, so a Methodist preacher was brought in. Margaret Thornhill stood by the grave in black silk, her face a mask. Catherine wept loudly and dramatically. Delphine was not permitted to attend, though she watched from a distance, holding the infant who would never know his father. The other slaves stood in their own group, separate and silent, mourning perhaps not the man, but the uncertainty of what would come next. The will was immediately contested. The probate court in Mobile, faced with a legal document that explicitly recognized a Negro child as heir to a substantial white estate, ruled that the will violated public policy and the established principles of Alabama law. It declared the provisions regarding Delphine and Edmund Jr. to be null and void. The estate was divided between Margaret, who received her widow's dower, and Catherine, who inherited the remainder. Delphine and her children reverted to the status of property, to be distributed as part of the estate inventory. But here the story takes one more turn. Margaret Thornhill, exercising her right under the settlement, chose Delphine and her 2 children as part of her portion of the slaves. Then in January of 1863, she manumitted them. The deed of emancipation was properly filed and recorded, though it required her to post bond guaranteeing that the freed slaves would leave Alabama within 30 days. Margaret gave Delphine $700 in gold, a substantial sum, and arranged for passage on a riverboat to Cincinnati, and from there to Philadelphia. In the manumission papers, she wrote, "These individuals are hereby freed not out of any affection or sentiment, but in recognition that they should never have been enslaved. Their freedom is an act of justice, long delayed." Delphine and her children left Alabama in February of 1863. What became of them afterward is largely unknown. There are records suggesting that a woman named Delphine Johnson lived in Philadelphia in the 1870s and worked as a seamstress, that she had 2 children who attended a school for colored children, and that she never married. But whether this was the same woman cannot be confirmed. The name was common enough, and the records of black families in that era are fragmentary at best. What is certain is that she vanished from Alabama history completely, as did her son, who had been, for a few months, the designated heir to one of the state's largest cotton plantations. Margaret Thornhill lived until 1879, dying at the age of 65, in the same house where she had presided as mistress for nearly 4 decades. She never remarried. In her later years, she became something of a recluse, seeing few visitors, and spending her time reading and maintaining her garden. Her daughter Catherine inherited what remained of Thornhill Estate, though by then the plantation system had collapsed, the land had been subdivided and sold, and the great house was falling into disrepair. Catherine's descendants left Alabama in the early 20th century, and the family name faded from prominence. The slaves of Thornhill Estate experienced different fates. Some were sold during the war to pay debts. Others remained through Reconstruction, working as sharecroppers on land they had once worked as slaves. A few migrated north. Their descendants, if they still live in Alabama, carry different names now, names taken after emancipation, and most have no knowledge of their connection to this story. The historical record is largely silent on their experiences, as it is silent on the experiences of most enslaved people whose lives were considered too insignificant to document in detail. What remains is a story that captures something essential about the moral catastrophe of slavery, something that goes beyond the physical violence and exploitation to touch on the deeper corruption of human relationships and human souls. Edmund Thornhill was not, by the standards of his time and place, an exceptional villain. He was in many ways a typical planter, educated, respectable, a pillar of his community. His sexual exploitation of enslaved women was not unusual, it was so common as to be unremarkable. What was unusual was his attempt, at the end of his life, to acknowledge what he had done and to make some kind of restitution. But even that attempt was compromised, tainted by the very power structure he claimed to reject. He could not simply free Delphine and support her as an equal. He had to make her an heiress, to impose his will, even in an act of supposed generosity. He could not let her choose her own path. He chose it for her, just as he had chosen everything else in her life, and in doing so, he created a situation that made her an object of hatred and suspicion, that endangered her life and her children's lives, that turned his own family against each other. His grand gesture of conscience destroyed everything it touched. This is what slavery did. It corrupted every human relationship it touched, turned love into ownership, children into property, families into inventories. It made moral monsters out of ordinary people, not because they were uniquely evil, but because they participated in a system that required constant moral compromise, constant denial of reality, constant violence, to sustain the lie of white supremacy and black inferiority. The tragedy of Edmund Thornhill was not that he was worse than other slaveholders, but that he was typical, and that even his attempt at redemption was doomed by the very system he had spent his life upholding. And what of Delphine? History gives us almost nothing of her inner life, her thoughts, her feelings about what happened to her. She exists in the historical record only as an object, first of sexual exploitation, then of legal controversy, finally, of Margaret Thornhill's cold act of justice. Did she love Edmund Thornhill? Did she hate him? Did she want to be named an heiress, or did she simply want to be free? Did she mourn him when he died, or did she feel relief? We cannot know, because no one thought to ask her, because her voice was never recorded, because the entire legal and social apparatus of the South was designed to ensure that people like her remained silent and invisible. This is the final
and perhaps most devastating legacy of slavery, the silence, the erasure, the countless lives that were lived in suffering and resistance and hope and despair, and about which we know almost nothing because they were not considered worthy of documentation. For every Edmund Thornhill, whose crisis of conscience left behind a paper trail in court records and newspapers, there were thousands of Delphines whose stories vanished without trace. These narratives reveal the true cost of chattel slavery, a cost measured not just in physical suffering, but in the complete destruction of human dignity, in the severing of families, in the corruption of every social institution, from church to court to marriage. They show us a society that maintained a veneer of Christian civilization while practicing systematic brutality, that spoke constantly of honor and virtue while building its wealth on rape and theft. And they remind us that this history is not ancient or irrelevant, that its consequences echo down through generations, shaping our present in ways we are still struggling to understand. The story of Thornhill Estate ended in dissolution and silence, in graves and burned deeds and names forgotten, but it stands as testimony to a larger truth, that slavery destroyed not only those who were enslaved, but also those who enslaved them, that it poisoned the moral foundation of an entire society, and that its legacy cannot be escaped simply by forgetting or by moving on. The past remains with us, in the land itself, in the wealth that was built and the poverty that was imposed, in the racial hierarchies that persist, in the silence that still surrounds so many stories like Delphine's. If these histories disturb you, good, they should. That disturbance is the beginning of understanding, and understanding is the beginning of any genuine reckoning with what was done and what continues to echo from it. This is the work of Shadows of the South, not to entertain with Gothic horror, but to excavate the real horror that existed, to name it clearly, and to insist that it be remembered. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to reflect on what this story means for how we understand our shared history, and to join me in this continuing work of bearing witness to the silenced voices of the American past.